In this video, we will cover the flipped learning model. To counter common misconceptions and bring clarity to discussions about flipped learning, the governing board and key leaders of the Flipped Learning Network announced a formal definition of the term. They also released the 4 pillars of FLIP and a checklist of 11 indicators that educators must incorporate into their practice. The group of experienced flipped educators also draws a distinction between flipped learning and a flipped classroom. In this video, we will talk about the 4 pillars of FLIP and the 11 indicators that educators must incorporate. First, let's define flipped learning. Flipped learning is a pedagogical approach in which direct instruction moves from the group learning space to the individual learning space, and the resulting group space is transformed into a dynamic, interactive learning environment where the educator guides students as they apply concepts and engage creatively in the subject matter. Let's talk about the 4 pillars of FLIP. As you can see, the pillars reflect the acronym FLIP. Pillar is a flexible environment. Flipped learning allows for a variety of learning modes. Educators often physically rearrange their learning spaces to accommodate a lesson or unit to support either group work or independent study. They create flexible spaces in which students choose when and where they learn. Furthermore, educators who flip their classes are flexible in their expectations of student timelines for learning and in their assessments of student learning. The indicators for flexible environment are: I establish spaces and time frames that permit students to interact and reflect on their learning as needed. I continually observe and monitor students to make adjustments as appropriate. And I provide students with different ways to learn content and demonstrate mastery. Pillar number 2 is learning culture. In the traditional teacher-centered model, the teacher is the primary source of information. By contrast, the flipped learning model deliberately shifts instruction to a learner-centered approach where in-class time is dedicated to exploring topics in greater depth and creating rich learning opportunities. As a result, students are actively involved in knowledge construction as they participate in and evaluate their learning in a manner that is personally meaningful. Checklist number 1 for learning culture is I give students opportunities to engage in meaningful activities without the teacher being central. And 2, I scaffold these activities and make them accessible to all students through differentiation and feedback. Number 3 is intentional content. Flipped learning educators continually think about how they can use a flipped learning model to help students develop conceptual understanding as well as procedural fluency. They determine what they need to teach and what materials students should explore on their own. Educators use intentional content to maximize classroom time in order to adopt methods of student-centered active learning strategies depending on grade level and subject matter. The checklist for intentional content are: I prioritize concepts used in direct instruction for learners to access on their own. I create and/or curate relevant content, typically videos, for my students. And I differentiate to make content accessible and relevant to all students. Number 4 is professional educator. The role of a professional educator is even more important and often more demanding in a flipped classroom than in a traditional one. During class time, they continually observe their students, providing them with feedback relevant in the moment and assessing their work. Professional educators are reflective in their practice, connect with each other to improve their instruction, accept constructive criticism, and tolerate controlled chaos in their classroom. While professional educators take on less visibility prominent roles in a flipped classroom, they remain the essential ingredient that enables flipped learning to occur. The checklist for a professional educator is: I make myself available to all students for individual, small group, and class feedback in real time as needed. I conduct ongoing formative assessments during class time through observation and by recording data to inform future instruction. And I collaborate and reflect with other educators and take responsibility for transforming my practice. If you would like more information on flipped learning, visit www.flippedlearning.org.